China-Africa trade sets a new record. We'll go behind the numbers of their growing economic partnership. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China has been Africa's largest trading partner for 14 straight years and its fourth biggest source of investment. Bilateral trade reached a record $282 billion last year, in part due to higher commodity prices and Beijing's push to promote imports from Africa. It is, by all accounts, a win-win for both, which is why representatives from some 50 African countries and international organizations are gathering in Changsha, China, for the third China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo. CGTN's Dai Kai has more in this report.
This year's Expo actually kicks off when the COVID is behind us, and this year also marks the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's been quite a journey for the bilateral cooperation, especially in terms of the economy and trade between China and Africa. We know that China remains to be Africa's largest trading partner for 14 straight years, and in the year of 2022, the trade volume, the bilateral trade volume between China and Africa hit some $282 billion US. That marks an 11% growth year on year. So other than that, there will also be, during the conference, the first ever release of China-Africa Trade Index. And according to experts, this is supposed to be a barometer for businesses engaging in the bilateral economic and trade cooperations between China and Africa. And we can also expect the latest version of China-Africa Economic and Trade Relations Report. So this actually was released for the previous two versions of the Expo, and we can expect the third version and the latest version of that, which is supposed to sort out the progress achieved in the past and also takes a look at the future trends in terms of the bilateral collaboration. And there will also be various high-profile events, also business matchmaking sessions, as well as various seminars during the event. Officials and business leaders certainly believe that this event will further strengthen the bilateral ties and inject a fresh wave of vitality for trade activities going both ways.
That's CGTN's Dai Kai reporting from Changsha in China. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is Africa Security and Policy Analyst. Liang focuses on international trade and finance as a chair professor at Willamette University. Also with us is Ken Gichinga. He's a chief economist at Mentoria Economics. And Ina Tangen is a senior fellow with the Taihe Institute and the founder and chair of Asia Narratives. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Ina, 50 African countries are represented at this third China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo. China is, of course, the African continent's biggest trading partner, with trade worth, as I mentioned, $282 billion last year. And of course, the continent of Africa has been a huge focus for Chinese foreign trade policy. Right now, how would you characterize this relationship?
Well, it's on the up and up. I mean, it's part of the global south, and what you're starting to see is China concentrating more on markets where it's welcome, where the Belt and Road Initiative is actually making a difference, putting the infrastructure in that allows these countries to do that. And it's not just Africa, it's also South America. There's a real push in the Middle East. But Africa has, if you start looking at the issues that are facing a lot of continents, Africa is definitely one of them. And China is offering a peaceful win-win solution that goes towards trade. Part of the four pillars which China now stands for, whether it's security, development, the Belt and Road Initiative, civilization. It's about respect and making sure that countries can go forward in a kind of Westphalian way and pursue their own interests.
So, Ina, right now we have African countries which tend to buy finished products from China. What are the main African exports to China?
Well, a lot of it is, I mean, a lot of the investment is in Nigeria, South Africa. A lot of it is related to minerals, resources that are taken to China, refined. But that is changing. China is very intent on making sure that there isn't this digital divide that could happen if emerging and developed countries try to hang on to all of the IP associated with technology advancement. There are a lot of partnerships that are going forward. It's an issue about sharing. And the reason is, we live on one planet, and China's motto is going forward together, not necessarily this idea that it has to be under one entity that is dictating the paths of all of these countries.
Ken Gichinga, that number that I mentioned, $282 billion in trade last year. Now, analysts do attribute last year's numbers in part to higher prices for commodities. And as we heard, that there are natural resources like crude oil, copper, cobalt, and iron ore. They account for a large share of Africa's exports to China. Here's the Chinese Vice Minister for Commerce, Li Fei, on Beijing's direct investment strategy. Let's listen.
China's direct investment in Africa has surpassed $30 billion, becoming the fourth biggest investor in the continent. About 9,000 medical personnel have been sent to African countries, and more than 100,000 training places have been provided. China has signed Belt and Road Cooperation documents with 52 African countries and the African Union Commission, and jointly set up a number of special work groups focusing on trade facilitation, investment cooperation, production capacity, and e-commerce.
So, Ken, talk to us about China's direct investment. Where has it mattered most?
Yes, indeed. The numbers are quite impressive. China really has been a major investor in Africa, the fourth largest investor in Africa. If you look at FDI numbers, the investments obviously have been on the big infrastructure projects. If you look at here in Kenya, the standard gauge railway has been what you'd call the flagship project. That has had its positive effects, but also has had a bit of its challenges in terms of its debt contribution to the public debt. But I think the idea of infrastructure, that there's an infrastructure gap in Africa, I think that still continues to be one of China's main economic agendas for Africa.
Okay, let's talk about that infrastructure gap. In fact, Anna mentioned it as well. Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the 10th anniversary of that initiative. It's a massive infrastructure project which began in 2013. What role has BRA played, not just in Africa's development, but also in terms of intra-African trade?
I think you've touched on two important issues there, Anand. One is Africa needs trade from outside to trade with other countries, and the second is Africa needs to begin trading with itself. And that has got a bearing of how Africa will be able to transit into, the next phase of its development. Because if you look at the population growth, there'll be a lot of people who need jobs. There'll be a lot of mouths that needs to be fed. But I think BRI is, in many ways, trying to address some of that. It's not just African countries trading with China, but it's also African countries trading with each other. And a lot of, what my former panelists said is large-scale infrastructure projects. If you look at some of the large-scale infrastructure projects, not just within countries, but across countries, those are largely funded by Chinese, and that, in due course, while we don't have all the data available, in due course, that will be good for Africa, and it will be good for partners who are trading with African countries, and that is not just Chinese, but also other countries. And that, I think, is also a lesson for many of the partners who are trading with Africa right now. The idea that Africa is a problem to be solved rather than opportunity, the way the Chinese investment, that's private sector and the state, sees Africa, is also a lesson in, look, this is the future. And the past might have a lot of problems, and there are still problems even now, But that is where the Chinese investments come in very handy.
Right, that's very important actually, because both sides see this as a win-win scenario. Liang, let's look at the situation in Africa right now. 546 million people were living in poverty in Africa last year. And as we are all fully aware, China has had enormous success in lifting people out of poverty. More than 800 million people, 850 million Chinese lifted out of absolute poverty. It's now helping Africa to alleviate poverty, among other things, improve agricultural production, better manage food security challenges, as well as promote wealth creation. How big are these challenges?
Well, I think the challenges are very serious, right? So that's why I think China is coming in as a partner that trying to promote economic development and to lift the living standards of the people. So when it comes to trade, as you just mentioned, a lot of people were asking, China is there just to have the resource grab. But let's face it, I think, even if these countries are trying to export, the industrial products, there are these barriers. For example, when it comes to cobalt, right, there's definitely the process where African countries should try to refine some of these cobalt instead of just exporting the cobalt ore. But the difficulty is, for example, power. Right now, half of the continent's people don't have access to electricity. South Africa right now is, facing the rolling blackouts and all of these. So I think the reality is there are a lot of the problem needs to be solved, a lot of barriers needs to be removed, and that's why I think China's investment is very important. They're not only investing in transportation, but also power generation, especially green power generation, such as the wind farm in Nigeria or the floating solar panels, in Namibia. And so all these could help to provide a condition for, industrial upgrading, to better the trade structures. Not to mention China is also planning to give 8,000 commodities duty-free status for Africa. So that would help to increase China's imports from Africa, to $300 billion by 2030. So I think all of these efforts will be tremendously helpful. And the last point that I want to make is, China is also really helping with, some of the very immediate needs of African people, such as last year, China funded and helped to fund $80 billion worth of the, similar to CDC in Africa to help to, promote health, to, reduce the spread of epidemics.
Aina, China is often accused of acting in bad faith when it comes to its relationship with the countries of Africa. And these accusations come mainly from the United States and its allies. And one of those complaints that we hear very often is that China is landing African debtors in what's been described as a debt trap. Both Chinese as well as African officials have refuted this. In fact, a report last year by the organization Debt Justice shows that many African countries owe 3 times more debt to Western banks, oil traders and asset managers than to Chinese lenders. Let's listen to Daryl Wade Swanepoel. He's the CEO of the Inclusive Society Institute, which is a South African-based policy center. Let's watch.
The business transactions are based on sound commercial considerations. It's not leading South Africa or leading Africa into the debt trap, as what is often accused. No, but from a South African perspective, if one does an assessment of the type of conditions attached to investments into South Africa, it is as sound as the conditions from the West.
So, what do you make of this debt trap argument that we hear so often?
Well, unfortunately, one of the Washington game plans are to accuse others of what it has done. If the United States had actually been leading the world, I mean, why are there such endemic problems in Africa? If you look at the history of the IMF, rather than helping countries, except developed countries, it has not helped developing countries. They have been subjected to very harsh fiscal measures. It's often been detrimental to their economies. And what do they always come in with? The IMF says, well, the first thing we have to do is make sure the foreign bondholders are paid off. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be, but the issue here is that there has to be some sort of balance. China is providing the pathway in which these countries can develop. And, this idea that, by providing roads, hospitals, schools, the infrastructure, electrical, communication is somehow bad for these countries is nonsensical. If the U.S. thought that they could do better, why haven't they? I mean, they've had since World War II to make an impact, and yet Africa has not gone forward. In some countries, they've gone backwards.
Ken, I want to talk a little bit more about the Belt and Road Initiative and its rollout on the continent of Africa. Of course, Kenya became the third country, that's after South Africa and Egypt, to sign on to the initiative, and that was in 2017. Took place under President Uhuru Kenyatta. How has Kenya benefited from this particular initiative?
Well, I think Kenya has, like many other African countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, have been able to be provided for in terms of linkages of infrastructure. So it becomes easier to be able to trade goods, export goods to China and to other parts of the world. So in its ability to connect Kenya to the greater China-Asia infrastructure, I think it's been excellent. I think my only worry right now is the growth in China is not what it used to be. The post-COVID recovery that we are expecting China to have is not as profound as we had expected. So to the extent that African countries can continue to export products to China and China manufactures to the rest of the world, in a world where the global economic growth is slowing down, I think that thesis needs to be interrogated a bit further.
Abdullahi, if we look a little bit more closely at South Africa's relationship, its trade relationship with China, it's a little bit different in terms of the products and commodities that are imported and exported. China is South Africa's largest trading partner. Last year, it accounted for 9.4% of South Africa's exports and just over 20% of imports, those figures from the South African Revenue Service. Now, South Africa is also at this stage, as Liang mentioned a moment ago, has a problem with generating electricity, with getting power to its factories, its homes and its businesses. It's seeking affordable solar panels, wind turbines, battery storage and renewables technology from China to sort of combat the shortage that it has. South Africa has a new Minister of Electricity, and he said earlier this month that he'd soon be announcing details of a major grant from China. What are expectations here?
Yeah, thank you. I think Eskom has become a really big problem for South Africa's business and economic reality, as well as homes, in terms of the rollout. I think the trouble with Eskom, it's been years of mismanagement, and the billions that they have in debt is a big problem. Secondly, the question around transition to green, clean energy is going to be very, very difficult. If it is not grounded in equity, it's going to be very difficult, because for most of the African countries, they're saying South Africa is leading in that direction. It's saying we have not contributed to the current climate crisis that we have. We shouldn't be the one to make that transition very quickly. But I think a combination of South Africa continuing to use coal to generate its electricity, helped by countries like China to come in and provide clean, green energy, that sequencing could probably take care of the equity that is required, because it's very difficult to make a decision about transiting to clean, green energy when you have a lot of mouths to feed and the industries need to be doing its work. But I think the route that China is taking is slightly different and will be more amenable to South Africans than the one that European countries and other countries in the West have been preaching to South Africa, to decommission its nuclear, to decommission its coal industries so that they can go clean and green, at what cost they might ask.
Right, Liang, you wanted to say something on this?
Yeah, so I think, again, China is committed to building the so-called Green Silk Road, and this idea that, if we don't build sustainable power sources or, infrastructure for that matter, all of these would become strained assets, right, when it comes to climate change. So I think it's important that China is providing the technologies, provide the financing to help to build these sustainable and reliable renewable energy sources. But again, all of these demands come from the African countries. They should take the agency to decide what kind of projects they would like to see in their countries. China is a facilitator, is a partner, but China is not dictating at what terms these African countries should make the transition and at what speed. And that, I think, goes back to this whole debt trap diplomacy argument. I think, again and again, credible sources have debunked this. Because this argument about that trap is simply, take away all the agencies of these African countries and pretend all these needs are not existent. And also these countries don't have any leverage with China, or, China is coming in intentionally trying to seize the assets of all these countries, which in reality is further from the truth. China is very sincere in any sort of debt restructuring programs, and China really see these countries as partners, and they want to have bankable projects.
Yeah, Liang, we've been talking about South Africa. Of course, it's one of the biggest economies in Africa. Of course, that other really big economy, probably by some measures the biggest on the continent, is Nigeria. What can you tell us about the relationship between China and Nigeria?
Well, I think the two countries really have a lot of complementarities. I think both countries are, really trying to improve their industrial grade upgrading. They wanted to improve their, sustainable development, and they also are putting a lot of emphasis on technologies. So I think, one of the things that we haven't talked about is, China's role in trying to, provide the ICT, the information technology infrastructure in many of these African countries. And, China has with Huawei and ZTZ, they have been building telecommunication connections in over 30 African countries. So I think with all these investments in connectivity, in terms of transportation, and in power utility as well as ICT, I think this is really the sort of the wholesale kind of investment that would help to strengthen Africa's economy and their sustainable future.
I know, of course, it's not all smooth sailing on the continent of Africa. If we look at the conflict in Sudan right now, it's complicated China's strategy of financial engagement in Africa. It puts at risk that loan from Beijing. Sudan's outstanding debts to China stood at $5.12 billion. That was in early 2022. How does that complicate China's strategy in the region?
Well, early on, China was doing government-to-government loans, in essence, trusting the governments to, invest in things. But the problem is that when governments change, automatically any business that was done by the previous government, especially loans and projects, are automatically suspect. And China got a lot of blowback from this type of thing. So what you see now happening is China is doing more project loans. They look at the feasibility of the actual project. They bring in banks, entities that can do the due diligence, and then they loan money. In terms of the past, it can't be changed. And the best that China can do is hope that there is a responsible government that will come forward to not interfere directly by itself, as other countries have done and only complicated the situation. But there's also, this competing interest that both Africa and China are fighting extremism, terrorism, and they want to make sure that, the countries that are trying to do that with governments are, in fact, supported, but not militarily. It'll be through economic means as far as Beijing is concerned, is my sense.
Abdullahi, what can you tell us about the strategic relationship between China and the countries of Africa? I mean, one of the things we have seen from the countries of Africa in recent years is that African leaders are now becoming far more assertive in exercising their independence.
Yeah, I think that is a very important question there. The reality is we are living at a fairly dispersed international order. It's not an order that was underwritten by Western countries post-1945. That order has been framed for some time, but we are seeing some of its impact on the African continent, in the sense that most of the African continent and the leaders are saying, wait a second, we do not have to go along with this. We can actually work with China on, let's say, large-scale infrastructure projects, although China is also diversifying, and they say we can get money from the Gulf countries, and then we can deal when it comes to software with Western countries. And a lot of anxieties that you hear around debt trap diplomacy. China is only interested in extractive industries and doesn't have the interest of African countries at heart, emanates from the fact that African countries and their leaders now have got a choice, have got an agency. Just last week, French president convened a large meeting around climate change and everything. So the Kenyan president making very clear that we need a new global financial architecture. You saw the Zambian president making very clear that we cannot be negotiating debt restructuring for 2 years. You had the South African president making it very clear that why is it that when you want us to support your cause, it is almost automatic. But when we had COVID, you did not provide us with vaccine. Not just that, when we asked for, suspension of IP, that is intellectual property for some of the vaccines, you refused. And so Western countries, in absence of policies, they're really struggling. So a lot of the time, my argument has been, it's not just that China sees Africa as an opportunity and Western countries see Africa as a problem. Western countries do not have an African policy. They have an anti-China and anti-Russia policies. So whenever those converge, it becomes a massive problem. I'll give an example. Sudan is going through a serious crisis. Conflict now, it's entering its 3rd month. Just for a second, go and look at the amount of aid that Sudan has received versus the amount of aid that Ukraine has received in those 3 months. The second and the final point that I want to make is nothing shows the challenges of Africa dealing with the West than climate change and migration. Most of these countries in the West, we've seen what happened with the crisis in Greece. So it is a serious problem, and I think this is the best time to be Africa. They can double dip and multiple trip in terms of their geostrategic interests.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.